alfalfa. Bean, like common bean, green bean, lima bean, scarlet runner bean, clover, carob, chickpea, fenugreek, hyacinth bean, indigo, jicama, kudzu, lentil, licorice, locust, pea, pain, red bud, soybean, tamarind, vetch. In today's episode, we are going to learn all about the Fabaceae family. In other words, the bean family. This is episode 4 out of 5 of the Meet the Plant Families mini-series. And as I've mentioned in previous episodes, if you have listened to those, then you'll know that these 5 plant families that we're talking about right now are ideal for planting in the spring season. So when it's a little cooler out, as we're moving away from winter and towards summer, this is a great time to be planting these different plants. So today we're going to focus on one main member of this plant family. And we're also going to talk about vertical space. I love talking about vertical growing, and especially if you're in a small space, how to increase your production by considering the vertical space you have to be growing food at home this spring. Now, let's get started talking all about peas. Welcome to the Growing Space podcast. I'm your host, Farmer Erin, owner of The Patio Farmer, and I believe that no matter what size space you have, you can grow food at home. Tune in every Tuesday as I share my best tips, tricks, and encouragement for tending to homegrown edible plants. I'm here to support your food growing journey. The Growing Space podcast is sponsored by Plant Club by The Patio Farmer. Plant Club by The Patio Farmer is a monthly subscription service I started in 2020. It's a membership-based opportunity to take your growing journey to the next level. With 4 different membership options, you get to decide the amount and kind of support that's right for you. All Plant Club members receive access to my online community through a platform called Circle. Having access to this platform allows members to share pictures, ask questions, celebrate harvest, and get to know each other. All Plant Club members also have access to free seeds each month, along with information on how to plant and tend to their crops, with seeding instructions and downloadable resources from the Patio Farmers Resource Library. Membership starts at just $14 a month. Join Plant Club today by visiting my website, thepatiofarmer.com/membership. So before we get in and start talking about peas today, I do just want to give you a quick little encouragement to go back and listen to some of the previous episodes in this little mini series. There have been 3 episodes ahead of this one. The first episode, we talked all about the brassica plant family. And then in the next episode, we talked about the Fabaceae plant family. Last week, it was all about the Asteraceae plant family. So go back, give those episodes a listen as you're getting ready for the spring season and you're trying to come up with, your list of things that you want to grow in your growing space and see what you can glean from them and take into your spring growing season. Spring will be here before we know it. When this episode is coming out, it will be towards the end of January, almost February. Or if you're brand new to this podcast, I am located in Charlotte, North Carolina, and we are hardiness zone 8A, which means that we have a pretty mild climate. We are lucky to be able to grow food year-round in our growing spaces, and I'm getting ready to plan for spring and start planting things outside next month. Yeah, like mid to late February, you can start putting in spring things. So, of course, all of the things that we've been talking about these last couple weeks. So as we're getting ready for spring, just go back and listen to those episodes on the different plant families. So the Fabaceae plant family, it's a pretty large plant family. It has over 20,000 species in it. There's lots of different plants that fall into this plant family. Some of them are edible, most of them are not. This plant family, of course, is the legume family. So probably one of the most notable characteristics of the Fabaceae plant family is the fruit of the plant, right? This is most commonly the edible part of the Fabaceae plants. This plant family generally produces as its fruit a pod, which contains a seed. Usually the seed is what we eat of this plant, but sometimes we can also eat the pods of this plant, the pods and the seeds together. So thinking about peanuts being members of this plant family, when we eat peanuts, we're eating the seeds of the plant. When we're eating chickpeas or lentils, we're eating the seeds of the Fabaceae plant. All the Fabaceae plants are just great plants to work into your crop rotation. If you have heard the term crop rotation in the past, then maybe you're already familiar with this practice. But if this is brand new to you, then the idea of crop rotation is that you switch up where you plant certain crops in your growing space to help just fortify your soil health. Different plants, as they grow, require different nutrients, and so they pull different nutrients from the soil. Other plants, as they grow, actually produce nutrients in the soil, which is one of my favorite reasons for growing Fabaceae plants. In the soil, their little root systems produce these nodules, and they're taking in nutrients from the soil, and the plant is growing, and it's wonderful. Those little nodules actually create nitrogen. Now, when we talked about in the first episode of this mini-series on plant families, we talked about the brassicas and how brassicas, because most of what we eat from those plants is either the leaves or the flowers that are fed by the energy that the leaves are taking in from the sun to create those flower heads. So the leaves are super important to those plants. The main nutrient that those leafy green plants need is nitrogen, right? That's the macronutrient that all plants need at some point in their life. But that nutrient is what helps to feed the green parts of the plant. It supports chlorophyll production. Chlorophyll, of course, is what is created in the exchange of carbon dioxide and water and sunlight to give the plant energy through photosynthesis, right? And the members of the Fabaceae plant family actually produce nitrogen as they grow. So it's literally like you are growing a crop that is feeding your crops as it grows. Now, if you have been listening to this podcast since the beginning, or maybe you heard the episode that I did on cover crops and sowing cover crops, then this will be a little bit of a refresher for you. And if you're interested in sowing cover crops, then I highly recommend you go back and listen to that episode, but listen to it as episode 14 and not episode 5, because I had a little mishap when I recorded it the first time. You know, as you can see, with today's episode being episode 19, I am still fairly green to podcasting. And episode 5, I had a little technical glitch, but I reshared it around Christmas time as episode 14. So go back and listen to episode 14 of the Growing Space podcast, all about sowing cover crops, if that resonates for you. But, you know, as I mentioned at the top of this episode in the introduction, some of those members that I read off are actually common in cover crop mixes. So like alfalfa and clover and vetch, all of those things we see in cover crops are because of this function of creating nitrogen in the soil as they grow. We are going to focus today on talking about spring peas. Those early spring peas are some of the first things that we can plant in our growing spaces for the new year. They don't mind being thrown out there while the ground is still frozen. They're one of the few things that you can put out even when it's like consistently very cold. And I'm sure I will do another episode. I mean, I have to do a whole episode just about growing peanuts, because if you have never grown peanuts before, oh my gosh. If you live in the right climate to grow peanuts, they are so much fun to grow and to harvest and just like be in the company of. So I will definitely have to do a whole episode just about peanuts. But today we are just going to talk about peas and spring peas, how to grow them, and what all you need to know. There's actually a couple of different kinds of peas, a couple of different varieties that grow really well at home. Of course, there's like traditional English shelling peas, which grow in long pods, usually about somewhere between like 6 to 10 inches long, depending on the variety. And those require you to break open the pod and shell the beans. Those can be harvested either fresh, or you can let them dry if you want to harvest your peas dry. So you can also grow edible pod peas, which I am usually a little bit more inclined to do. When I grow edible pod peas, I never actually like get inside with my harvest in the time it takes me to walk around and harvest all my peas and then walk from my growing space to my house. If I'm lucky, I have half of what I've harvested because I just love eating them fresh. They're so good. Your edible pod peas, those are going to be your snap peas, like your sugar snap peas, and your snow peas. So usually sugar snap peas, they are a little thicker, and they generally have like this fibrous little string that you can eat, but sometimes it's more enjoyable to just like peel that string off and then eat the fresh pod. Snow peas, you don't have to do that. They don't have that like really fibrous stringy part along their spine, and you can just like snap into them nice and freshly harvested. These are the peas that I usually like to grow in the spring. You can also grow them in the fall. That hasn't always been part of my growing practice, but last year I grew fall peas and it was just so much fun. I think I'm like converted now to growing peas in the spring and fall. So if you've never grown peas in the fall, I highly recommend it. It's quite the treat. Peas also need at least 6 hours of direct sunlight every day to thrive. Like any of our other vegetables and crops, they'll take more sunlight, but they need at least 6 hours. And whenever I am growing peas at home, I usually just direct sow them and not use a transplant. I mean, you could buy like baby pea seedlings at a nursery or a garden center, but they grow really quickly from seed, and they tend to have more fragile root systems. So sometimes they don't transplant super well. Plus, something that's really important to know about peas is they're a vining vegetable. We'll talk about that in more detail. But as seedlings, if they're vining vegetables and they happen to get like intertwined in their little seeding cups, and then you like go to try to separate them, like it can just all be a little stressful for them. Plus, we can direct sow peas outside as early as like mid-February. Like the seeds are pretty large and easy to handle. Using a plant that has a larger seed can be easier if you're working with kids or if you're apprehensive about seeding in general. Direct sow seeds, here's your invitation. Because these plants, they produce nitrogen in the soil as they grow, you really don't have to do a whole lot to your soil in terms of adding nutrients or amending it before you sow. If you're using like old soil or you're kind of concerned about the quality of your soil, you don't have to worry about that with peas. You can literally just sow them wherever you have some soil. You can grow them in pots. You can grow them in large containers. You can grow them in raised beds. You can grow them directly in the ground. Wherever you have some soil, just pop some pea seeds in this spring. You can sow them pretty closely together So ideally, you would have one pea plant growing every 2 inches in your growing space. So you can either sow your peas, one seed every 2 inches, or you can sow one seed every inch. And then as they grow, as they germinate, you can thin them so that you have one pea plant growing every inch. Some people don't feel super comfortable with the idea of thinning. That is like culling the baby seedlings. And that's understandable, So if you want to avoid having to thin your plants, then keep your spacing to one pea seed every 2 inches. You want to plant your pea seeds kind of deep in the soil, so at least an inch down into the soil. One thing to know about seeding peas, especially if we get like a lot of rain, is that sometimes that moisture can push the seeds up to the top of the soil as they're germinating. It's totally normal and it's totally fine. But if you happen to see your little pea seeds pop out of the soil before they sprout, just, very gently push them back down into the soil and cover them up. And then that's, they'll be good to go. Their root systems are pretty shallow, so they don't need a whole lot of soil depth to grow, which is great. So if you have kind of a smaller pot or a smaller amount of soil to be growing in, you can still grow peas pretty successfully. As I mentioned earlier, peas are a vining plant, which is really important to keep in mind as you're growing. And peas give you an early opportunity in the season to practice vertical growing, which is one of my favorite things to think about in my growing space. Is not just how you can be growing food out horizontally or like your horizontal space in your growing space, but also your vertical space. So if you truly are growing food in containers on your patio or your porch, or, at the front door or on a deck or at the base of a set of stairs going off of your deck or wherever you have room, maybe you're on a balcony and you have a railing. It's important to think also about your vertical space because you can really maximize the things that you are able to grow and your productivity for your space. So today's episode is a little nudge, a little suggestion for you to consider your vertical space that you may have to be growing food at home. So peas, as they grow, they send out these really cute little tendrils. That's what they're called. They're little tendrils. And they're not leaves and they're not stems. And they're not really vines. They're more like these little appendages that have sticky little hairs on them. They're really small hairs. You can hardly ever see them, but they have little sticky hairs on them. So the purpose of the tendril is to reach out and to grab. Yeah. So it's trying to guide and lead the plant where it can vine and grow in between structure. It's important that you give vining plants structure to grow on for several reasons. This is going to help pollinators find the flowers of the plant. Fun fact / spoiler for you on spring peas, they first produce a flower that requires pollination. And then from that flower is where the pod forms, which is what you're going to eat. So you want those flowers to be easily accessible to your pollinators as they're flying by. But with the more ventilation and airflow that you have, or the fuller your fruit is able to grow because there's not any like space competition, airflow also improves the overall health of the plant. It helps to keep pests and disease away. So there's many reasons why, if you're growing something that vines, that you give it the support that it needs to grow. You can support your plants in all different kinds of ways. Usually when I'm growing peas or beans or cucumbers even, which we'll get to when we pick back up on this plant family series and talk about the plant families for summer. Can't wait. One of my favorite things to use is just a simple trellis or A-frame trellises. And so it's basically like two flat wire structures that fold at the top, and it can open up like a little ladder almost. And you put each side down in the soil, and then you sow your seeds on the edges that are in the soil of the trellis. And then it grows up one side and down the other, and then up one side and down the other on the other side. If you have kids, or like, even if you don't have kids, I think this sounds really dreamy. You can create like a pea teepee in the backyard. You can do a small version of this, or you could do one that's like big enough to crawl under and actually like hang out in your pea teepee if you want. If you're going to do one that you can actually like go in and hang out under, you might want to forage for some bamboo, which if you also live in North Carolina, then you know that we have just tons of bamboo. We have an invasive species here. If you don't have access to bamboo, then you can also use like branches that fall, but you essentially like lay them out in a teepee structure. You combine them at the top, use some like rope or twine, depending on how big your structure is. Tie them all up at the top so you have like this cone shape, and then you run your string or your twine in between all of those and kind of like alternate when you're going under and over. And so that creates this trellis structure so that as your peas are growing up the trellis, they're creating like this solid wall of like pea magic. And then you can crawl under there and like you can harvest all of your little edible pods. You can also do a smaller scale version if you have smaller pieces of bamboo or like some trellising, like tomato stakes or, whatever you have just around. You can make a little trellis in your raised bed or even in a pot. Like I have totally made teepee trellises in pots before, but those are great for supporting your peas as they're growing, or really any vining vegetable. You can also use existing structure. So if you have a fence, or if you have like a deck railing or a set of stairs or a balcony railing, you can use those structures to help guide your plants in growing vertically through those structures to be supported. Another thing, and keeping with this vertical space idea, is when you're growing your vining vegetables, asking them, instead of growing up a trellis, to grow down. Just hear me out for this idea for your spring peas. If you have somewhere where you could put a hanging basket, and the top of the soil in the hanging basket would get access to sunlight, 6 hours of direct sunlight, you could plant your spring peas in a hanging basket. And then as they're growing, the little peas, instead of growing up the hanging basket, they can grow down the sides of the hanging basket. So it's a way of like adding some dimension, adding some character to your space, and also growing something edible. But there are these great containers that you can grow in. They're veggie towers. They're like plastic tiered planters, and they have little pockets all around the sides that you can plant like small little plants in. Those are great for increasing your vertical space as well. There's so many options out there. And, when we're growing in small spaces, it's so important that we utilize the space that we have to be as productive as we want it to be. And being the patio farmer, this is where I really specialize, is helping people find these little nooks and crannies and places that they might not have thought about previously, and transforming those spaces into food producing spaces. Towards the end of every episode, I like to close out with a fun fact, either about me or about plants, or maybe it's a recommendation or some tiny little morsel to sign off with. And this week, I am sharing a personal little snippet of information, and it's no big deal or anything, but like yesterday was my birthday. Yep, January 29th. So hurrah, happy birthday to me. I love birthdays. Birthdays are the best. They're just a great excuse to treat yourself to something fun. So I definitely am treating myself to something fun this year. And I hope whenever your birthday rolls around that you treat yourself to something fun too, because you know what? You deserve it. Heck yeah, you do. Next week, we are going to talk about our last spring plant family. It's going to be a big one. And we're going to talk about the Rosaceae family or the rose family, most of which are perennial and fruit producing. So this year I wrote an entire planning calendar called Growth. It's filled with 52 weeks of intentions, reminders, and advice for growing food at home in 2024. I will put a link to this in the show notes. And if you are interested in grabbing my calendar, it's just $35. And it's a digital resource where you'll be able to receive a weekly intention, a weekly reminder, or piece of advice from me throughout all of 2024. Thanks again for tuning into this week's episode of the Growing Space podcast. I hope that you learned something new and that you were able to take this new information home with you and implement into your growing journey and into your growing space. As always, I am here to support you and your food growing journey. If you'd like to learn more about the different services and resources and membership programs that I run through The Patio Farmer, please check out my website, thepatiofarmer.com. You can also follow me on social media. I am on Facebook, Instagram, and oh my gosh, most recently, TikTok. Wow. I know. Here I am. Patio Farmer is on TikTok. It's very exciting. If you enjoyed today's episode, please give it a like or a rating or a review if you want. Maybe share a little comment about your favorite part of the episode. Share it with a friend. The more interactions I get with my little podcast online, the more I'm able to help people just like you in their food growing journeys. As always, thanks for being here, and I will see you again next week.